Good afternoon. My name is Dr. David Kordertz from Clemson University. I am a member of the Biomedical Engineering Society Education Committee, and on behalf of myself, the Biomedical Engineering Society Education Committee, and the Biomedical Engineering Society, we would like to welcome you to the first of these educational webinars. Today's webinar will be on the subject of how to prepare an effective poster presentation. Before we begin, there are a few announcements that we have. The webinar is being recorded, and the presentation slides for the recording will be available for access on the BMES website in the following days. You may also submit questions throughout this webinar using the chat feature. You will see a window in the corner of your box which you can enter questions, and we will bring these questions up to the speakers at the end. Some questions may not be answered immediately, but will be relayed to the speaker as time is available. So these announcements, these presentation slides, you can go on bmes.org e-learning. Just remember to use the chat feature. So before we begin, there's a couple of questions we'd like to ask you folks. First of all, what best describes you? Please respond now. So we have about 39 results. So if we go ahead and close this poll, you can see that about 65.9% of the participants in this are graduate students, while about 19.5% are undergraduate students. So it's a good mix of graduate, undergraduate, and early career professionals. So moving forward, we have one more question for you before I pass it off to our first speaker. The first question here is, have you ever presented a poster before? So seeing these results, the majority of you have presented a poster before, which is excellent. We have two excellent speakers today, the first of which is going to be Dr. Chris Billiar from WPI, and the second will be Dr. Craig Gorgin from Purdue University. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Billiar. He is an associate professor of biomedical engineering at Worcester Poly Institute, where he has been since 2002. Following 4 years in industry as a staff engineer at Organogenesis Incorporated, he received his Bachelor of Science in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Cornell University and his MS&E and PhD in Bioengineering from the University of Pennsylvania. The focus of Dr. Billiar's research is tissue mechanics and mechanobiology, the way in which mechanical forces regulate the development and healing of tissues and the pathogenesis of disease. He teaches biomechanics and design courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Many of his courses are designed as a writing intensive and include end-of-term poster presentations. Dr. Billiar has been an active member of the Biomedical Engineering Society for over 20 years. He is a member of the BMES Board of Directors and recently stepped down as the chair of the BMES Student Affairs Committee. Dr. Billiar is also a Fulbright Fellow and member of the Executive Board and the chair of the Education Committee for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Bioengineering Division. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Billiar.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. So it seems that most of you have already given a poster presentation, so why listen to this? Well, I'm glad you did tune in, because there are some best practices that even I don't pay attention to sometimes, so hopefully we can all learn from this. And I've taken from other groups, and I'll show you some resources at the end where there's some nice online resources that you can see a lot of this information in addition to seeing these slides in the future. So what I'm going to talk about is the nuts and bolts, the anatomy of developing a poster. It'll have 5 parts, and I'll go into varying depth on each of those parts. The first is you have to know your audience and why you're preparing your presentation. You will want to change your poster based on different audiences. Then, like any presentation or paper, you need to assemble your content. But you're going to have to simplify that content for visual presentation on a poster, really identifying the important message, supporting info, developing a really nice flow and minimizing text, or people aren't going to really want to read your poster, and it's not going to draw a crowd. Design visuals are incredibly important for this poster because it's a visual version of your presentation. Even things that's text types and sizes matter, and we'll go over some do's and don'ts for graphics. And then finally some nuts and bolts about assembling the poster and some general best practices. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the target audience and how you're going to present the poster, because that's the second presentation today by Dr. Gorgin. But I will mention that you do have to take into account your audience. There are some cases where you have a layperson or a scholar from your field, or for many students, it'll be a student paper competition. And of course, you're going to want to do a different kind of presentation if it's for a competition where they're judging you and your poster. And also, what's your motivation? Are you trying to inform somebody of the information or persuade them into your way of looking at it? And are you trying to establish yourself as a scientist, or again, maybe competing in a poster presentation? Now, assembling the content, as I mentioned before, just like any paper, you got to have a good title, professional tone of that. Of course, you have to have your co-authors and institutional affiliations, and generally they're going to want to have those logos. Like I have in the upper left, we got a brand new logo. I got to put that one up. The abstract, which I'll discuss in the next slide in a little more detail, is optional, but for me, I think it's important. You'll always have to have an introduction, stating clearly some background information, and really important, the goal. If the reader doesn't know the goal of your study immediately, you're going to lose interest. Materials and methods, of course, you have to put in there, and schematically, that really helps because, again, this is a visual representation. If you can draw schematics instead of just a list of the methods, that's going to be very helpful. The results, both qualitative and quantitative, again, graphed. I'll go into that in much more detail. Then a discussion, conclusions, and maybe talking about the future. Don't forget your acknowledgements, especially the funding. Your PI will be very upset with you if you don't put in the right funding agencies, and references. And here I won't mention this again, but when you put in the references, you need to cite, just like in a paper, but generally you're not going to have room to put a ton of references in there. And you can generally, these poster presentations don't say you have to use one style or another, and I'd suggest you use an abridged style where you don't put the full title, maybe not all the authors for every article, so you can fit in the lower right-hand side a succinct little section of references and not use up too much of the real estate on the poster. So back to the optional abstract, which I think is very important. I'll mention this a few times. This is the only place that I would suggest that you have anything with a subject, verb, and a period. So no sentences anywhere else in your poster. Now that's different than you might hear from other places, and there's differences of opinion, but I think there should be the only place that you put sentences. So an abstract has 6 parts, and you don't want to miss any of them. You got to start with the significance and scope of the broader problem. If you don't draw the reader in and tell them why they should be looking at it, then you're going to lose them. You have to clearly identify the gap in knowledge, which will then lead clearly to your goal or hypothesis that will fill that gap. Your methods will be very, very short, maximum 1 sentence here, because it's going to be graphically related later in the poster, and then very short qualitative and hopefully quantitative results right up there, and then a comparison with literature and a short conclusion. And don't forget the conclusion. It's very important. Don't let your readers figure out what you want them to figure out. You tell them what you want them to know, or how you think that they should interpret your data. That's a very common mistake. People end with the results and they expect the reader to figure out what it means. So as I mentioned, we want to simplify. Let's say you're trying to put a whole manuscript's worth of information right on this poster. Clearly you have to simplify it. So what's the most important, what is the core takeaway idea? Now you can put that a couple places. You can put that in your abstract, and you can put it in your conclusions, or as shown in this graphic, you could have the core takeaway idea right there in the blue box I have at the bottom. Then you can work around that and ask yourself, what is the key supporting information you need to get to that one core idea? If it's not key supporting information, you can leave it off your poster. You may need to put it in your manuscript, but not necessarily the poster. As will be highlighted in the second half of this presentation, this is a presentation. Someone who just sees your poster without you there is not going to get the whole idea. You're supposed to be in front of it discussing it. Now, as I mentioned, no paragraphs, not even sentences I would suggest. You want to use bullets. And the golden rule for how many bullet points you can have under any subheading is 7 entries. And that goes for web design also. I can't reference who said it to me, but a few people have told me this. Grouping your concepts in less than or equal to 7 concepts is what people can handle. And you want to have a visual flow directing the reader. I suggest, as is shown in this example, 3-column format. People will go from the top of the left column down to the bottom of it, then they'll go to the center, and then they'll go to the right column. That's just natural. Don't be constrained by that. If you get really good at making posters, you can have arrows, putting them in different directions. You can have 2 columns, lots of things you can do. But for the beginning person, and even for me, I'm an engineer, I like to have, here's how to do it, make all the posters look very similar, but be very clear, and then they get the point across. Design visuals are incredibly important for a poster, which is a visual representation of your data. I've read in many different places that we should avoid tables. Graph the data. People enjoy looking at the graphs better. This particular graph right here, I don't actually like that much, but I put it on as an example to talk about. It's from University of Texas website, which has wonderful resources for this. One nice thing about this graph is that its companion graph plots again the difference, if you see in the green, and you notice that the color matches. So in one part of the poster they're using green for difference, in another of the poster they do the same thing. Now I said I had a few problems with this. A figure caption should go below the caption and not be a title above it. It turns out that in Excel the default is putting the title above it. So the general best practice is to put a caption below describing the figure. And describe what you want the author to get out, the reader to get out of the figure, not just say this is the data or these are the data. Also, if you look in these, another nice Excel format that's automatic is these cross lines. I don't like the cross lines, and in the case of the left-hand graph, the cross lines obscure relationships in those red and green, red and blue lines. So if you mean for people to look upwards and not across at the relationship between the amount in this graph and the time, then these crosshairs get in the way. On the other hand, on the right graph, maybe the cross lines are useful because they show you how much % difference you are in any case. The green color is also an Excel standard, but green on white doesn't show up very well, as you can see, compared to the red on blue. So I suggest using darker colors on a light background. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. I'll give you a second to read this. Now, there's a few things you can get out of this. One, my main point here is significant figures. And actually, I'll go back for a second. If you look at the graph on the right, there's 100% 0.00, and I'm sure they don't have that many significant figures in the actual data. So that goes for this also. They get down to the 20 people, and that's a very specific number. And what can get lost in numbers with too many significant figures is people focus on the number and not the comparison or the changes or the trends you want them to see. So focus more, make sure you have the right significant figures so that they can see what you want them to see out of the data and not focus on little details. When you enter graphs and plots, I'm talking about PowerPoint now. That's what I usually do to make my presentations, my posters. I generally paste a picture, a JPEG or a PNG file. TIFFs are generally very large files. I don't put them instead of the native Excel file, just cutting and pasting. The nice thing about having an Excel graph or a graph from other programs is that you can change the font on it, you can change things with it once it's on your poster. But the problem with having those linked files is when you click on it the wrong way, it might go and try and open up your Excel file. It gets very confusing sometimes. Also, when you resize the picture for your poster, the fonts all change, and you have to go and mess with them. So I usually put it as a picture, but that again is a personal preference. Also, when I make the figures, the general figures when you make a graph, generally they'll have a white background. But you may have some off-color background you're using, or you may want to put graphs next to each other. And if you have a white background, they will actually occlude whatever's behind them. So I suggest selecting no background when you're making a graph and then importing it. The photos, as you see, the 96 DPI photo that you've shown there is very fuzzy. You want to have at least 150 DPI when you're putting a picture in. And in this presentation, DPI doesn't really mean that much because it depends on how big your screen is, as how many pixels you have per inch. But on the poster, you're actually going to be printing in actual inches, so the DPI matters a lot. If you put something in at 96 DPI, and then especially if you expand it then on your poster to make it a bigger picture, it's going to come out very fuzzy. So make sure you use at least 150 DPI. Many places you'll look on the web, or experts will say you need a 300 DPI for presentations, or manuscripts, even 600 DPI. That's great, but they do get to be very large files. A line art or an EMF file won't actually get any larger because those are actually using postscripts and such. So those are nice to use. I'll let you read this for a moment. All right, meant to be a little bit funny. My last point here is don't use comedy unless you can actually do it, so I apologize for that. But this is from PhD Comics. But clearly, your engineers, we need to use proper axes or people won't understand what is the data that's being presented. In terms of the actual fonts themselves, you should be able to read the poster from about 3 feet away. Now, how do you determine that? Probably no smaller than 20 point when you're looking at it on your screen will show up. I took a Toastmaster course many years ago, and they suggested that you should only use sans serif fonts such as Arial, and rather than serif fonts such as Time when you're doing a presentation. Whereas if you do written work on a manuscript, you should use a serif font. Now that's a lot of the standard templates you'll find in PowerPoint will be in Times, although the new ones are coming out in these new fonts like Calibri, which are sort of a mix between serif and non-serif. So it gets to be a little less important now, but generally you're going to want to use a sans serif font. I'd like you to look at these. These are examples from Stanford. They provided me with some information for this talk. And I'd like to run a poll on the next slide. Which poster would you like to read? So it looks like poster B won. My 5-year-old daughter agrees with those of you who said poster B when she was looking at these last night with me. But some of you like the nice bright colors of the other one, and that's a point of preference. But according to the experts on these subjects, avoid using contrasting, conflicting colors, let's say. You don't want to shock your audience. They'll also get tired eyes by looking at something that's too bold. Okay, these might look a little better to some of you, but maybe a little less clear which one you like better. So for another poll, I'd like to ask which poster would you like to read? And then I'll do a subsequent poll after looking at them again. Maybe you can give me some comments why you like one over another. So take a look at them for a moment. So It's a little bit more even this time, which I'm not surprised. It's a bit of a trick question because I think there's some things that could be better on either one of them. So I'm going to go to that one and ask you what you think you would like, what you like about them, or actually I'd rather concentrate on what do you think could be better about them. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. I'm seeing great, I'm not sure if you guys can see all these responses, but there's great ones about background, should be lighter, be more clear, change sources, contrasts. A lot of it has to do with contrast I'm seeing here. And so let me give you feelings from the University of Texas website and from my own point of view. The first thing is that, let me skip to one of the problems, is it's hard to read dark on dark, and it's hard to read light text on light. So that's one of the dangers of using a dark slide and dark text. Now, the problem with using a dark slide with light areas in it is the dark text won't look good in the dark areas, and the light text won't look good in the light areas, even though the streak of light coming from the upper left is pretty cool. It may not be so great for a poster. I want to back up for a second, is that if your university or lab has a template that you have to use, then this is moot. You got to use it. But it doesn't mean you can't give them suggestions on some best practices. Now, picture backgrounds can be really cool. I've seen them used very effectively with a bioscaffold in the background and such. But as you see in this one, I like the light grass. I like the blue sky in the background. It makes me feel good. But the graph details get obscured. Part of them are on a light background, part on a darker background with the grass, the lines in there. The red on green is especially a problem if you have colorblind people. So putting a lot of color in there can be nice, but not so much in the text. Usually you want to use a dark text on a light background. Again, as we saw, that blue and yellow was very clashing. You don't want to use that, but you do want to use good contrast. And again, I'm going to suggest dark text on a light background, but I'm kind of boring. Now to the real nuts and bolts is how do you even assemble this poster? You can make some mistakes here by putting in the wrong numbers when you're setting up the poster, and then you send it to the printer and they give you something back that doesn't look so good. So generally you're going to want landscape. I have not seen many conferences where they ask you for a portrait style taller than wide poster. So you're generally going to pick landscape. And then in PowerPoint, you go under Design and Page Setup, and you can actually set it up to exactly the size you want in inches. So you're not doing an 8.5 by 11 and then blowing it up. You're actually making it the right size, 48 inches by 36 inches in this case. Now, a lot of poster presentation will say you have to fit on a 4-foot by 8-foot board. I don't suggest making your poster go right to the edges and be 4 feet by 8 feet. First of all, it's expensive to print it. You got to fill up all that space, but it's also overwhelming for the viewer. Here's an example that looks pretty good to me, but not quite enough white space. Those pictures really come and push up on each other, and there's text everywhere. And this is a schematic here, again, from the University of Texas site, but they suggested putting in some more white space to divide and guide the readers. And a little bit more nuts and bolts when printing it. Everything I've shown you so far is basically in PowerPoint making one large poster and then printing it as one piece. You still see when you go to conferences people printing out individual slides like a PowerPoint presentation and putting up. I don't advise that. Generally, you're going to send your PowerPoint, and sometimes your group will want a PDF to the campus printing service for maybe $25, $30, sometimes a little bit more depending on how much color. If you use a dark background, it's going to cost more money to print a lot of times. It uses a lot more ink. Kinko's FedEx, if you need it quick, they can do it for you also, but it's generally going to be a lot more expensive, especially if it's a rush order. Having nice large pictures is really good, but they do start making the file size very large. If you can compress the pictures down to a reasonable size, let's say 150 dots per inch, as the picture size that you actually have on your poster, get it down to like 5 megabytes, your printing service will probably be a little bit happier with you. I'm almost done here. I just want to show a couple examples and give a couple of my own feedback for these types of posters. Now this poster is a student poster for a class I've taught, and I've told them what to do for the poster presentation, but it's hard to assemble all that and learn how to do it quickly. You just look at this, you get your first impression. They did a lot of work, which is great, but if you look right in the middle, there's a table. As I already mentioned, we don't want to have tables at all if possible, but certainly not all of your raw data. There's no way the reader's going to get what is your main point out of that. The figure text is a bit small. I should be able to read it from here, basically. And then they have nice pictures of all these bones that they broke, but you don't need every sample a picture of, maybe a representative sample. On the left, what I like is that they have a picture of what they actually did for the testing, and then they drew over it to make it somewhat a schematic to show where the loading is. I like that aspect. I'm sure you have many more comments that could go on this one. And one more example. This one does use a dark background, and I think that dark background really brings out some of the text, but it uses text bubbles or blocks in there that have the good contrast of dark on a light background. And this color isn't going to cost that much more to print because it's only tiny little edges. This has fun rotated photos, but it's for a lay audience. I wouldn't suggest for a scientific poster, engineering poster, to be putting pictures of people on there in all different angles. But this was for an REU program, so I thought it was appropriate. There's paragraphs in this. Again, you should use bullets. And I thought the color in the table that was chosen for this one, a little bit of green and a little bit of color, gave the poster a little bit more color, and I thought that was helpful. And now I'm just going to end up with a little bit of checklist. You need an effective title. You need to be clear what your objective is and clear what your main conclusion is. And not just clear in your mind, but clear on the poster exactly what they are. Give the reader a logical flow to go through your poster. Legible text and graphics from at least 3 feet away, if not 5 feet away. Multiple types of visual aids, some schematics, some photos, some 3D representations possibly if you can. Try to be as consistent with the graphics, so if you have red indicating one thing in one picture, put red in the other picture. Give enough white space. You can always cut down the text because you're going to be in front of it presenting it. And always cite the literature as necessary and give proper acknowledgements, which I will attempt to do here. One original version of this was given to my students by Zoe Reidinger, the TA in my biomechanics lab class. I got a lot of good feedback from the University of Texas at Austin, and they allowed me to use their images, as did Stanford. And my school, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, has a nice set of poster tips online also. Thank you very much.
All right, we would like to thank Dr. Billiar for his very interesting talk on posters, on the mechanics of presenting a poster. I have received only a very few questions so far, so we do encourage you to use the chat feature throughout to send questions to everyone, and we will respond to all the questions at the end. I will now introduce Dr. Craig Gorgon from Purdue University. Dr. Gorgon is an assistant professor in the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Washington University, St. Louis, and a Master of Science and PhD degree in bioengineering from Stanford University. His postdoctoral training in molecular optical imaging at Harvard University Medical Center is focused on cardiac diseases and left ventricular modeling. His current research efforts focus on the use of ultrasound to assess the variety of vascular diseases and implantable medical devices. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gorgon and to present poster presentations more than just the poster.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to all that are participating in this webinar. I hope you found it useful so far. Dr. Billiard's done a great job kind of guiding you through the nuts and bolts of what it takes to put together a poster. But this second half, I'd like to focus more about how to guide people and an audience through your poster in a way that presents it in an engaging and thoughtful manner. And just as a reminder, yes, please do add questions on the chat on the left, and we can address those after this. So a brief outline of my talk is now shown here. First, audience identification, and Dr. Billiard talked a little bit about this as well, but we'll go into more depth about what you should think about as you guide people through your poster. Ways also to engage with people, to bring them in and make them interested in your work. Some networking tips and tools as to how to provide contact information and work with other people around the country that may be interested in your research. Further resources on the web as well as other places, and then some take-home messages as a summary at the end. So really the first thing you should think about is to know your audience. And as you put together your poster, this will certainly be what you should be thinking of as you figure out what to include and what not. But once you have it together, you should really be thinking as well who you'll be speaking with. Some may have seen your abstract in the abstract book, but most will not have. Will they be a lay person and a scholar from the field, or will they be a scholar in another field that may not have a lot of background in your area? Dr. Billiard also mentioned several student paper competitions, in which case you have restrictions and emphasis on certain aspects of your poster presentation as well. But really you should be thinking about how to engage and pique interest in a wide general audience that may be having a broad background. So try to adjust your presentation or what you're talking about to each person so that it fits with what their background is, what they're interested in, and what they may be interested and focused on from your work. So, for example, at the Biomedical Engineering Society annual meeting, you'll often run into many types of biomedical engineers. And so the field is broad and varied. It could be somebody that is interested in and does research in biomaterials or immunology or microfluidics or molecular biology or drug delivery or genetics or medical devices or protein engineering. They may have a specific disease focus like cancer or cardiovascular disease or orthopedics. They may have experience in industry and regulatory aspects, or they may be in academia or another student. So think about and try to figure out who the person is as they come by, and try to have this broad background section so that you can really pull people in from multiple different ways. The people that will be at the BMES are hoping to view many different posters at this time. So try to be aware that they may not have 30 minutes to stand by your poster and go through everything in detail. Have something short so that you can go through it and highlight the main points so that they understand what's going on without having to spend 45 minutes talking with you. Really, I would suggest trying to prepare a 2 to 4 minute talk. Have this practiced, be able to know where on the poster that your figures are or main points. Be sure that there's a clear background so that you can cover what exactly the overall goal of your work is. And then focus definitely on the highlights of the work and the figures. There's the schematics that you have together. Try to summarize the major points at the end and really put the work in a larger context, because if you aren't able to do that, you won't be able to reach an audience outside of just your specific area. And really, with this 2 to 4 minute talk, practice beforehand. Do it in the mirror by yourself with the poster behind you. Try to do it to scientific colleagues or others in your lab that may provide specific details and feedback. And also do it to lay people or your friends and family that may be able to provide input as to what was confusing. And then once they provide feedback, incorporate that into your presentation style. So these are just some suggestions of questions to ask and a way to engage an audience and make sure that they are understanding what's on your poster. A lot of times people will come by, kind of glance at your poster, not really want to spend a ton of time there, but if you notice them reading, come up and ask, would you like an overview of my poster? And if they say yes, then try to find a little bit about their background. See if they have any particular interests or a background in a specific area that you think you can highlight in your research as well. And try to make it as much of a conversation as possible. Ask them, does what I just said make sense? Does this figure seem to make sense to you or show what I'm trying to say? And with that, then it can be a two-way conversation, so you can highlight portions that they may be interested in as well. So first, polling questions. I'd like everybody's feedback as to when you're presenting a poster, do you tend to look at just the poster, just the viewer or the audience, or try to go back and forth between the poster and the viewer? Please submit your responses now. Great. Okay, we have 48 responses, and the overwhelming majority tends to think that you should look at both the poster and the viewer, which I think is the best approach as well, because then you're guiding the viewer's attention to different portions of your poster as you talk about each section. If you look at just the poster, you may not have an idea of what's behind you or who's going to be stopping by. If you look at just the viewer, then you're not really using the poster as a way to present your research, so nobody can actually see what you're going through. So try to go back and forth between the poster and the viewer, moving from side to side to make sure that you're not blocking it as you present each different portion. So engineers aren't always the best at this, but human interaction is important. And really, I've found that if there's one engaged viewer that is looking at your poster and going through it, it helps to bring in other people as well. So make sure you have a firm handshake, make eye contact, be confident and clear as you try to go through your poster. But if they have questions as well that you're not exactly sure what the answer is, don't be afraid to say you don't know, or that you'll come back to them and give an answer later, because they may be more of an expert in the field than you are, and you don't want to overstep your bounds in that way. From a communication standpoint, really making sure you speak clearly and slowly is important. If English is a second language to you, try to have something prepared, but don't be reading from just a script because it needs to be more of a conversation. As you go through, make sure you ask if the person you're speaking with or anybody else has any questions, because you may be skipping through things at a much too fast pace, and they need to kind of step back a few steps to make sure they understand what you're going through. And really, make sure you smile and have fun, because this poster's presentation is supposed to be an interactive way to show what you've done in a research setting. So it's much more appealing for the audience to come talk to somebody who's engaged and smiling and glad to be there, rather than sullen or unhappy to be presenting the poster. So another option is interactive posters. So I wouldn't recommend this for all applications, but there are times when animations are really important and would explain a concept or a topic much better than a static poster. So I've seen people present little small laptops that are plugged in on a table nearby a poster, or if you can pull out a phone or a tablet that can show an animation to help describe a concept. That's something to maybe consider if something that needs to be moving is really important. If you're working on, let's say, a device, or you made something for a senior design project or some other project, and you actually have the physical object and it's not hazardous or too big, maybe bring that and have that with you so you can show people what you've put together, or have a physical item in your hand. And finally, maybe some demonstrations if there's something that you can show with these objects that helps explain what you're trying to talk about. Maybe that's something that you should think about as well. In this case, there's actually a Pepsi poster on public transportation here, where you can plug in with headphones to hear more about their details from their poster. So I think this might be a wave of the future with interactive posters and making it more engaging for the audience. So here is an example that I found online from eloquentscience.com, a blog where this poster presenter was able to make an interactive poster that had wide interest. So you can see in the poster here, there are flaps where you can take the test and read the questions on the left and see if the answers underneath fit with what you were thinking as well. This may be a little over the top, but in some cases that makes sense as a way to kind of engage the viewer and have them see each individual section without having to read the whole poster at once. I do like, though, the fact that he has a table here and pamphlets and handouts that he can pass out to interested viewers as they can take with them, so that they don't forget it the moment that they walk away from the poster, but they can see it as they go home that night and look at it later. So with that, the next polling question is, do you bring business cards to conferences? Yes, you have them all the time, sometimes. If you remember them, maybe. No, you don't think it's important. Or the last choice, D, what is a business card? Feel free to answer now. Thank you. Great. So with 54 people responding, over half say that yes, they do bring business cards to conferences. I think that's a great approach. 15% say sometimes, and 30% say no. I would highly suggest having a business card. I think it's a great way to exchange contact information. That way people can know where you're coming from, even if you're not, senior faculty. It makes sense, undergrad, grad, postdoc, industry level, everybody should, I think, have some way to exchange contact information. Further technical development has led to the phone bump. You can watch a video and do other things to actually exchange your contact information by bumping phones. And really the most important thing is to make sure to ask for their information as the audience passes by, because it's nice for them to know who you are, but you should try to follow up and learn more about them as well, especially if they're in your field. Another idea is to have a paper printout that's hopefully legible of your poster so that you can actually hand to people, or a link or an email version of the PDF of your poster available online or available electronically so that people can see it, again, after the poster presentation. And if you have any pamphlets or publications that are help supporting your work or your research that are presented on the poster, see if having at least a few of those printed out and able to hand out to people again would be a good idea. So after the conference, it's not over. You should try to learn about those who stopped by. You hopefully have a bunch of business cards or other email addresses, and try to follow up either through email or even a phone call if they seem particularly interested in your work, and thanking them for the interest. If you can maybe send supporting publications or other information that will help. This is a lot of times how collaborations are started. And these connections can often last a really long time. It's how you network not only with people in your specific field, but in other areas that can lead to collaborative efforts across disciplines. So be sure to make sure you look at, after the conference, connecting with people that stop by. Some other resources that are online. If you ever need to have a peer-reviewed publication highlighting the good ways to present an effective poster, there's actually some of those on PubMed. There's also some 10 simple rules for good poster presentations in PLOS Computational Biology, another article there. And then for a good laugh, if you ever want to read about the mortal sins of poster presentations, they give you a how-to guide on how to give a poster presentation that no one's going to remember. Two more, practicing your poster presentation is outlined in this link here from the University of Minnesota. And then some do's and don'ts of good and bad poster presentations are provided by the Block Lab at Stanford University. So with that, I'd like to summarize this section with a few take-home messages. First, know and think about your audience. Make sure you have an idea of who will be stopping by your poster. Try to develop an engaging presentation that brings people in and is exciting to learn about. Be confident in your research as you speak about the different topics and what you've done in the study. And then try to network before, figuring out who might come by, during, as you exchange contact information, and after, as you follow up with emails and phone calls. And last but not least, remember to have fun and enjoy yourself as well. So with that, one more poll as well. Do you feel like you are now more confident in preparing a poster because of these webinars, this webinar? Yes, it was helpful somewhat. Because you're still confused, or not really because you are an expert already? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the positive feedback. There are some outliers, as you can see, for the somewhat and not really, but it's been great to have the overall positive impressions here. So I'd like to acknowledge Amy Boguki, an undergraduate student in my laboratory that helped put together this poster presentation, as well as thank you all for your attention. I'll pass this now back to David.
All right. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Gorgian for his presentation about the mechanics of doing a poster presentation. So at this time, we're going to open up the floor to questions. I've only gotten a couple from the audience, but I guess we'll start with this one, and this is open to either of the speakers. Some people have noticed that people are putting business cards and resumes next to their poster, whether they're there or not. They wanted to know sort of what's your take on this?
I guess I can handle this. This is Craig. I think that that's a great idea as long as the poster can be up for a significant portion of time without you there. A lot of times other conferences require you to take the poster down an hour or two after you're done presenting it. So in that case, it doesn't make sense to have the cards or something else up afterwards. But if there's a conference where your poster is going to be up without you for a long extended period of time, I think that's a great idea to have a printout and business cards available for people that will want to contact you later.
And a question that just came in for you folks is it okay to have refreshments next to your posters?
Chris, do you want to handle that?
Oh, I don't have any great insight. If you're talking about, if the question is about your own refreshment, I think people understand if you need a drink of water or a coffee while you're giving your presentation. But generally, you're going to want them to be drinking the coffee and you just want to be paying attention. You can go get a refreshment afterwards. If you're talking about supplying all the refreshments, they'd love it. But usually they'll have coffee at poster sessions.
So another question that's come up is, do you actually use PowerPoint? Because apparently someone has had a problem and is talking about using Publisher that with 4x8 posters that they had it divided up into parts.
This is Chris, and I'll answer that one also. A Publisher is very nice also. I'm sure it's fine to use. I find that PowerPoint is just a little bit easier for me to use. And again, if you go under the page setup, you can set it up to be 4 feet by 8 feet if you really wanted it. Now, no matter, one thing I didn't mention, I said I suggest not making things 4 by 8 feet. That's just amazingly large poster. But also your publisher on campus may not be able to do it. Most of our machines here do a 32-inch, and then you can make it as long as you want. So the golden rule is about 4 by 6, or the ratio of the different dimensions. So you set it to whatever they can print cheaply, and, which is usually 32 inch or 36 inch for the paper size, and then you can make it about 4 feet wide. You don't really want a bigger poster than that. But in terms of whether you use Publisher or PowerPoint, either one will work well.
And I'll just add, this is Craig. I enjoy using Adobe Illustrator more than either of those. I think it just has a little more functionality with it, so that's another option for people that don't want to use PowerPoint.
And I'll comment also that I've used all three, and all three definitely work for any size poster that you're trying to work with. I think Illustrator is probably the most powerful of the group, but PowerPoint's definitely the most friendly. So,
right.
So the next question that I got over here is, what would you put on a business card for a graduate student, and how many should you get printed? And given that you will be changing these details as you progress through the program.
So this is Craig. I totally understand that. I know I've been in positions that were just limited in time and didn't want to get 1,000 cards. But usually when you make an order for business cards, you can get smaller amounts that aren't too expensive without having to get 1,000 or more. So there are a lot of schools and universities have resources for this, as well as you can actually make your own. I've done this before online. There are services available to, you can put logos or other detailed information about who you are. And as a graduate student, I would put research assistant or some other position or PhD candidate on your card to let people know that you're on your way to the degree that you'll be getting soon, but that you're not quite there yet. And that way, they'll have, the most important thing is your email address, really. Maybe a cell phone number or other telephone number to reach you. But just some way to get in contact later on, regardless of whether or not your degree or your title is going to be changing the next year or two.
And this is Chris. Another option to kind of mixes that with having a actual copy of your poster. Sometimes you don't want to give away your entire poster because there's something you're about to publish on it. You could have your abstract, which is available anyway on a page, and have your email address and your contact information at the bottom of the abstract, so that if you hand out that one single sheet, someone's just as likely to keep that one sheet as to keep a card in their pocket probably.
Okay, so continuing on with other questions. So what is the average submission fee for a poster or a presentation at BMES or other similar conferences?
This is Chris again. I believe BMES is $30, but it might be different this year. Other conferences, sometimes it's free.
Yeah. And a lot of times, this is Craig, you don't know as you present an abstract whether you'll be presenting a poster or an oral presentation. So you have to figure out later on what kind of presentation you'll be giving.
I'd like to add on to that, and it's often considered that posters aren't as prestigious as oral presentation, and that's just a fact. It isn't considered that way to many people. But personally, I like posters better in many cases. You can talk to only those who are interested who come by the poster, and you can talk to them for a half an hour instead of giving a presentation and maybe having one question at the end. So hopefully there will be a change in tide that people actually respect posters, are happy when they get a poster presentation. And many times when I'm involved in organizing conferences, we make a very big effort to have unopposed poster sessions with refreshments so that people will go to the poster sessions and not just go to the talks and miss the posters. So I think at BMES there are very nice poster presentations, and you should be proud to get a poster.
And I guess I'll comment. I was just going to comment that some of the meetings that I go to in the imaging world, they try to evenly distribute the posters and talks so that there is no difference in prestige. It's just how you fit with the sessions that are going on.
Yeah, and I agree. This is Craig. I love the human interaction portion of the poster and think you can really learn a lot more presenting about your audience as well as walking around and then picking and figuring out which areas that your research really fits well with from the poster standpoint.
Okay, and as we're continuing forward, if anybody still has any questions that they'd like to forward to our speakers, feel free to please enter them in the chat box. We have a few minutes left for questions, and I'm going to pose a couple more. I guess we just got, what's the best way of giving a firm handshake if you have sweaty palms?
This is Craig. I think the best approach is to wipe them on your pants right beforehand. See if you can get away with some of the sweat. And everybody has sweaty palms at some point, so people will understand. But don't hold a wet drink. Make sure that you're not too hot, and wipe them on your pants real quick. That'd be my suggestion.
Excellent. So I guess. Are there any more recent publications you could recommend on poster presentations?
Chris, do you want to handle that, or?
No, I mean, these websites have nice general information. I haven't actually read the literature on poster presentations. Toastmasters is an amazing way of getting practice doing these presentations. I'm not a member of that, but it is quite a great organization to be involved in if you want to get good at presenting.
And I would say the best approach would be to contact people in your lab that have presented posters recently, or other graduate or undergraduate students that have just been to a similar or the same conference, to get an idea of how many people might stop by, how big and long the poster presentations are, and get a sense of what to focus on for it.
And I think a question that we just got is actually quite interesting. They said, what would you suggest doing if you have been speaking to one person in particular for a while about your poster or research presentation, and you notice that other people are coming and would like to speak to you as well?
This is Craig. In that case, I try to answer the question or talk about my poster to one person while also bringing in the second, third, and fourth. I try to see if that makes sense then for the whole group, or ask them if that's an area that they're interested in as well. So that you're not, saying I need to leave the person that you've already established a connection with, but you're not leaving out the other 3 or 4 people that are now by your poster trying to get information as well.
Okay, we would like to thank everyone out there for their questions and comments. We have sort of run out of time for questions today. However, if you do send any further questions, they will be forwarded on to our speakers and hopefully will be responded to quickly. If you would like to take a few minutes as you leave, there will be a quick survey that will give us further information. There are a number of things coming up with the Biomedical Engineering Society, just for your information. The annual meeting this year will be in Seattle, Washington from September 25th to 28th. The call for abstracts and the submission deadline for these abstracts will be April the 2nd. There will be a number of professional development webinars like this one, which will be coming in the coming weeks and months. There will be one on grant writing, March the 27th, industry career development, April the 17th, best practices in teaching, May the 16th, learning and developing networking, and best practices for running and managing a lab. Beyond that, there will be a number of career events available to you depending on the region you are in, so you can look on that last slide for those. Thank you again for your attention. We hope you can join us over the next months for these future upcoming webinars, and you can start to sort of look, and you can find this list on the BMES.org website. Again, thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful afternoon.